Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Republicans say that they are the party of law and order, and when it's convenient, they get behind the Constitution when the politics suit them. But in a minute, I'm going to show you how the GOP lawmakers across this country are targeting some of our fundamental basic rights that really are the bedrock of this country. I'm going to start by reading from the First Amendment itself, and I quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble." Now we're going to focus on that last part of it, the right to peacefully assemble. It's exactly what people have been doing since George Floyd was killed last Memorial Day in the overwhelming majority of cases. That, according to several reports, that more than 90% of social justice protests we've seen since then have been just that, peaceful, with no injuries or property damage to report. But let's not let the facts get in the way of a good political opportunity. Republicans in dozens of states are now starting to pass laws trying to clamp down on demonstrations. And I'll give you an example. A proposal in Indiana, it would ban anyone convicted of unlawful assembly from getting a job with the state, including elected office. Minnesota bill, it would prevent people from receiving student loans or state jobless benefits in the same situation. Florida, they're imposing even harsher penalties for protesters who cause property damage that will now be considered a felony. Plus, Republican lawmakers in several states, they've passed bills that would grant immunity to drivers who hit protesters on public streets. And before you say, well, that might be crazy, but it never happens, it happens a lot more often than you'd believe. USA Today, keeping track, paper says there were more than 100 incidents of people driving into protests just last summer. 40 of those drivers, they face charges. And sometimes incidents like that are fatal, including when a white supremacist drove into the crowd in Charlottesville in 2017, killing a woman named Heather Heyer and injuring 30 others. He did it on purpose, got convicted, and is now serving a life sentence. I want to bring in my guest to discuss this, Vera Eidelman. She is staff attorney with the ACLU. And Vera, this is happening. I gave just a few states. There's more that are in this process that seems to me, a solution looking for a problem. But let's first get to the Constitution, the basic protections when it comes to free speech and assembly. We're getting into scary territory with what they're doing here, aren't we?
Definitely. And I think that you're absolutely right to highlight this as a troubling trend. We've seen more than 90 bills proposed in at least 36 states, not a coincidence that they have largely been proposed following a summer of historic protest in which, as you've just been describing, millions of people went out into the streets to protest the continued practice of police killing Black people. And the response that we're seeing from legislators is not engaging with that message and trying to end the reality of police brutality, but rather attempts to silence people and stop them from exercising their fundamental First Amendment rights.
Let's give a very brief history lesson, because protest is the DNA of the very formation of this country. I mean, you want to go to Boston? Let's talk about what happened with people protesting the Tea Act, or how about more recent times? I go to Vietnam with sit-ins, etc. You follow this logic. If you just get cuffed because you're sitting in a public place protesting something, now you can't get employment. You can't hold elected office. You'll be denied benefits. I really find this curious, especially from some of the same people who had no issues with what happened on January 6th, taking this to an unbelievable conclusion now. As I said, 9 out of 10 of these protests didn't cause a penny in damage, let alone any arrests, but here we are.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's so important to remember that protest is part of America's DNA. And a lot of the bills that we're seeing are going after just seminal types of protests that we think about. Protesting in the streets, things that have been essential for civil rights marches, for workers' rights marches, even for folks who are protesting the right to have an abortion. Any number of people rely on access to public streets to make their message heard. And so many of these bills, including the hit and kill bills that would make it so that people who unintentionally hit a protester are not liable for any injury that is caused to that protester, take direct aim at those fundamental rights and fundamental American practices.
So I'm going to give a recent scenario, and tell me if I get this wrong. In Charlottesville, when white supremacists with tiki torches talked about not letting Jews replace them, talked about basically a purity march, and you didn't have to read between the lines here that they'd like to basically purge anyone that wasn't white, they would have no criminal exposure, but the next day, when somebody plowed into a protester and killing them, conceivably under this new Florida law, they get a get-out-of-jail-free card.
I think the worry is that exactly something like that would happen. These bills are limited to unintentionally plowing into protesters. So I think there's a question of fact there that we don't really have to touch. But I think what you said about the fact that just over the summer, we've seen 104 incidences of cars plowing into protesters, resulting, as far as I know, in at least 2 deaths and paralysis for other folks, including in states that are actively still considering such bills. That's a real problem. And the message is it's physically dangerous to go out and express your views. And that is absolutely not the message that the government should be sending.
And again, with that carve out that Ron DeSantis, who not coincidentally is a rumored potential Republican candidate in 2024, it has earmarks of me of the stand your ground. And we saw, well, on paper it makes sense, but you see what happened with Trayvon Martin in that story. You're giving liberties to people and you're injecting a political equation into it as well. Nobody gets to be shocked later on if there's a tragic outcome here.
That's right. I think the incentives are really being shifted in truly dangerous ways.
How do you think this eventually gets sorted out? Because as we said right off the top, you're talking about basic constitutional protections. Is this going to make its way through the courts eventually to the high court to decide how far a state can go to limit speech in assembly?
It certainly could. A lot of cases do raise questions like that. I think that a number of these bills could stop and should stop in the legislature. They should not be passed. For the bills, the few that have already become law, I think it is absolutely possible that they will be challenged in court. And I think some of the theories under which they could be challenged are pretty bread and butter First Amendment questions, ones that really shouldn't go beyond the district or lowest court level. But it is possible that they would.
Finally, I know we hit folks with a fire hose of news every day. It's been like that for the better part for 4 years. But Vera, even though for most of us we grew up that when the Supreme Court made a definitive ruling, Roe v. Wade, whatever the case may be, okay, that's the law of the land. But even just a cursory view, your basic right to vote is being threatened in state after state. Your right to voice your opinion, including protest and assembly, in that regard, is now being threatened in state after state. Your right for control of your own body, even as a woman, is again being restricted and threatened in state after state. There is a wave of these kind of cases going on, and I'm not sure the public fully grasps the scope of the restrictions that are happening at state levels right now that are not settled law anymore, it seems. We're revisiting this, but it has to go to state capital after state capital to finally get your rights back.
I think there's a difference between what's settled law and what legislators are willing to violate, notwithstanding the fact that it is settled law. But it is a real problem that we're essentially having to go back to bread and butter constitutional principles and having to sue if laws like this are passed. It wastes taxpayer money, it wastes government time, and it violates rights.
Vera Eidelman, good stuff. I appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Now, when we come back, speaking of what we thought was settled, but yet a different perspective, Derek Chauvin, he's in jail awaiting sentencing. And the reaction to his conviction, though, has not been unanimous that justice was served, not by a long shot. After the break, I'm going to show you how Fox in prime time is dealing with the news. And it is some dangerous rhetoric coming out of the mouths of Tucker Carlson and friends.